Well, we come to this final lesson in our Habakkuk series, and we might want to ask, will Habakkuk get anything resolved? Well, he will. He will. And we find in this final chapter, only 3 chapters in the book, a prayer. And isn't that where we often get things resolved, really? Is in the context of prayer. It's not really in arguing with God. It's not giving a complaint to God. It's not even getting God's answers or being in a debate with God. It's in listening to him and responding to his word. And that's what we have in this chapter. We get the great resolution of Habakkuk's dilemma. This is the whoa dude part of the overview that we gave. It literally is praying yet. And chapter 3, verse 1 makes this abundantly clear. Here's what we read, a prayer of Habakkuk. So we've moved from an oracle of chapter 1 to the complaints and the responses, and now a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet. According to Shigit-noot. It's a difficult Hebrew word, but what it means is to pray something with great emotion. So this is not just an academic exercise for Habakkuk. This really matters. Habakkuk calls upon God's faithfulness in the past to help him get through, which is always a good thing to do. Let me read chapter 3, and verse 2 and the first part of verse 3. O Lord, I've heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. God came from Teman, which is a mountain, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. What is Habakkuk doing here? He's drawing upon the faithfulness of God in times past. He calls it the midst of the years. Remember your mercy, God, in all times past. Go clear back to your work with the patriarchs. Go with your work in the conquest. Go with your work in the judges, the time of the judges, and all the kings that have come down to even King Josiah, and now the kings that aren't so good in the time of the coming of Babylon. Come from the high places, meaning the heavens. The Hebrew word for heaven is Shemayim. Come from the Shemayim, meaning the mountains that are mentioned here. And just help us see that you've got this and that you're in control. I'm going to read down through these 15 verses from the latter part of verse 3 to verse 15, and you will see in this section, Habakkuk is calling upon his sanctified memory of God's work and way. He'll deal with things like creation, God's ability to make things and do with them as he wants. He'll deal with things like the Exodus. A few of these phrases will sound like the Exodus. And he will even deal with the conquest, the book of Joshua, where the people of God came in, crossed the Jordan River on dry ground, just like they had walked out of Egypt the same way. And they will conquer city after city after city. And while this is not hermeneutically or homiletically tight, as is often the case with the prophets, they kind of skip around a little bit. Even predictive prophecy is sort of piecemeal and fragmentary, and it makes sense after the fact. Somebody has said that all predictive prophecy is 2020 once it happens. Well, sure. But listen to these words as Habakkuk draws upon the faithfulness of God. The last part of verse 3, his splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. Boy, you read Genesis, you read some of what the Psalms say about the creativity of God. It makes it brilliant. His brightness was like the light. Let there be light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. So creation is being indicated here. Creation says God is faithful. God keeps his word. He goes on to say in verse 5, before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. Again, you could impose some things like maybe Noah and the flood and creation, but pestilence and plagues and things like that sounds like God's people in Egypt. It's just not quite as clean as other textual divisions maybe. In verse 7, I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. You remember Moses was part of his time spent in Midian, and he was going to retire probably at age 80 when God said, nope, you're going to Egypt to deliver my people. So when the places of Midian trembled, would that be when God was on the holy mountain speaking to Moses about his mission for him? Verse 8, was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea? When you rode on your horses on the chariot of salvation? Boy, this is highly figurative, but it could be referring to God bringing his people out of Egypt and drowning Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea. You stripped the sheath from your bow, calling for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. The raging waters swept on. The deep gave forth its voice. It lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their place. Oh, wow. Are we to assume that this is a reference to the conquest in the days of Joshua? Are we to interpret it that literally? Maybe not. At the place your arrows as they speed and the flash of your glittering spear, you marched through the earth in fury. You thrashed the nations in anger. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from neck to thigh. Could this be a reference to Saul and David and Goliath and all that era of Israel's history? I don't know. He's got the little phrase, Selah, 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 which is just a musical term of an interlude of some kind. So maybe these are segments of Israel's history, perhaps. Verse 14, you pierced with his own arrows the heads of his warriors, who came like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret. You trampled the sea with your horses and the surging of mighty waters. These are highly figurative pieces of speech that I think, as I mentioned, deal with creation and the Exodus and conquest. Basically, what he's doing is reviewing biblical history. And it's in the review of biblical history that he's able to think of the faithfulness of God, using powerful imagery and metaphoric expressions to kind of get his point across. Now we come to the climax of the book. And this is really where the theme of praying yet comes very, very clear. So we come to chapter 3, verse 16. I might just say as an aside, this is one of the famous 3:16s of the Bible. The Bible's filled with them. You ought to take your Bible and look up all the 3:16s because many of them you already know. Of course, the most famous is for God so loved the world. But in this 3:16, this is what we read. I heard, or ESV says, I hear, and my body trembles. Now, why is he shifting gears? This sounds poetic. This sounds like a song of sorts. And the word for hear is the famous word Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love him with all your heart and soul and strength. I heard. Well, what was it that Habakkuk heard? He heard of the coming judgment of God through the means of Babylon. And when he heard this, he's just giving his own personal testimony here. I trembled. My lips, he's a prophet. He's supposed to use his lips, even quivered at the sound of this coming. I believe it's the Message paraphrase by Eugene Peterson that says, my stomach did flip-flops. And that's how he's feeling. Somebody said that soul and body live so close to each other, they catch each other's diseases. So he's feeling something in his gut and feeling something in his heart, feeling something in his soul, and it's making his whole physical body respond. He says, rottenness enters into my bones. When King David was outside the will of God and he wrote Psalm 34, maybe after writing Psalm 51, he said, let the bones which you have broken rejoice. And the Hebrew word actually means dance. When I didn't confess my sins to you, O God, my bones wasted away. Here he's saying, rottenness enters into my bones and my legs. Well, you didn't know that Elvis Presley made the Bible, did you? But he actually did. Good old Elvis. When he sang the song, I'm all shook up. That's exactly what this word means. It appears a second time now. My legs trembled. It's the Hebrew word ragaz. And it literally means I'm all shook up. So just think Elvis Presley singing. My legs beneath me, yet, oh, there's our word, yet. It will appear down in verse 18 again. Yet I will wait quietly for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. Are you good at waiting patiently? I'd have to confess I'm not so good at that. Habakkuk is realizing that God's going to use Babylon to punish the people, and he's having to sit tight and wait for it to come. It's hard to wait. You'd like it to just come and get over. But then he says, yet, I'm going to do this. I will wait patiently for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. So the reason he can wait patiently is because he's kind of learned of Babylon's demise in chapter 2. Now, verse 17 is powerful. Verse 17, as I mentioned in the overview lesson, has 3 couplets, 6 little phrases, and they're powerful. Though the fig tree should not blossom. Well, I never lost any sleep on that one, because I don't have a fig tree. And the first fig tree I ever saw was when I was in Santiago, Chile, for a missionary conference. There wasn't around much fig trees. I grew up in Iowa. We have corn and beans there. So I don't know much of fig trees. But a fig tree is actually a symbol of Israel. And a budding, well-laden with fruit fig tree means God has blessed you. Oh, though the fig tree doesn't have blossoms, that means it won't have fruit. And there's no fruit on the vines. I grow a little garden, but I don't harvest any grapes. You use grapes to make wine. No fruit on the vines. Produce no olive. The produce of the olive will fail. Well, do you know that Israel exports more olives than any other country in the world? Israel's just a little small nation, but they grow a lot of olives. So you've got figs and you've got olives and it's the oil that comes from, you've got fruit on the vines. And then he moves from agrarian to animals. The fields produce no food. The flock be cut off from the fold. No herd in the stalls. Well, maybe you never lost any sleep on that. Maybe you have a pet, but I don't know if you have cattle or sheep. So why is Habakkuk saying all of this? 3 couplets, 6 little lines. Here's the significance. In Leviticus 28, Deuteronomy 28, and Leviticus 26, those 6 things are mentioned as terms of the covenant. In other words, Habakkuk didn't make that list of 6 up. What he's saying is, oh God, if you even stripped everything away from us that you promised you would give. What's the next word? Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on high places. And then the book ends to the choir master with stringed instruments. The power of praying yet. Even though it looks bleak, even though Habakkuk doesn't have all of his doubts answered, even though he still has questions as to the ways of God, he's willing to say, yet I will rejoice. I'll take joy in the God of my salvation. He makes my feet like the deer's feet. Well, that image, of course, like a longhorn sheep or some kind of animal that climbs the big, tall, steep, rocky mountains, they have sureness of footage about them. In other words, in the midst of everything, when everything is coming loose from its foundations, what Habakkuk is saying is, I will be like a deer that has its feet securely planted. Again, quoting from the Message paraphrased by Eugene Peterson, he says it this way when you get down to verse 19, God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on the high places. He calls it, I'm turning cartwheels of joy. And that's why I've titled this last lesson, Cartwheels of Joy. You can move from a position of great doubt and a great struggle in faith. But when you get God's perspective and your faith becomes informed, You realize that your questions about faith have been answered. So much so, you can be putting it from your prayer closet to song. The book of Habakkuk ends with this, to the choir master. What's going on? Habakkuk has come out of his prayer closet and he's saying, in the words of one commentator, put that to music. Put what to music? Put this to music. Put the idea of praying yet. Go into the Garden of Gethsemane and hear Jesus pray yet. Go on Peter's fishing boat on the Sea of Galilee and hear Peter say, yet at your word I will let down the nets for a catch. The earnestness to pray yet. One of my students years ago in a message in class said that he was part of the military. I don't remember what branch, but he said they had a saying in his part of the military, and it was this: the test of a soldier is what it takes to stop him. Well, what's it take to stop you? Questions about faith? Questions about God's way? We started this series by suggesting that, we do have questions about faith. Lots of them. And sometimes they lead to significant doubts. But doubts can be solved by study, by reflection, by prayer. And that's the kind of thing that Habakkuk has done. He's gone into Israel's history to look at the faithfulness of God. He's been willing to venture his own struggles of faith in the presence of God. And he comes out by saying, if God took this away, and God took this away, and God took this away, even after he said he would give us those things, yet I will rejoice in God my Savior. This minor prophet, whose name means embrace, had embraced a greater faith because he realized no matter what happens in life, he could still pray yet.